Hello and welcome to the GreenTruth podcast by TiiQu, your go-to destination for insightful conversations on sustainability. We're committed to delving into diverse perspectives on environmental issues, guided by the belief that embracing truth empowers us to create a better world for generations to come. Today, we're looking at sustainability and the built environment. Buildings account for a staggering percentage of global carbon emissions, so the potential for transforming this sector is immense. From green certifications to retrofitting old buildings, the journey to a sustainable built environment is filled with both challenges and opportunities. Joining us today is Eleni Polychroniadou, co-founder and chief executive officer of Cintali, an environmental certification body that's working to transform the way we think about buildings. Through their work with the EDGE Green Building Programme, they're creating pathways to ensure that every building on this planet can become a part of the solution. But today's conversation isn't just about certifications. It's about the bigger picture. Why this work matters, what's holding us back, and how we can break through barriers to scale sustainable building practices globally. So whether you're a developer, homeowner, or just curious about how the spaces we live and work in can shape our planet's future, this episode is for you. Let's get started. So Eleni, the building and construction industry is responsible for 39% of energy-related CO2 emissions. That's the stat from the UN Environments Programme and the International Energy Agency. And that's just the energy. Can you just paint a picture of how the built environment impacts the environment around us and why its impact is so large and needs addressing?
Absolutely. I think it's quite a shocking statistic as you've outlined, and not something that we typically think about. We kind of take buildings for granted. We just live in them and work in them, but we don't really think about what impact they have. And when we think about a building, the first and foremost is the energy that a building is using, but also the energy that was required to construct the building. So there's two things when we're talking about buildings. One is operational carbon, operational energy, and the other element is the embodied carbon, the embodied energy. Operational is, you turn your lights on, it's using some element of electricity. Where is that electricity coming from, and what does that impact the environment? The other, of course, is heating, cooling. All of that is requiring electricity and fuel consumption, typically coming from fossil fuels, therefore contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. But the hidden element of what we don't really think about is every single material that goes into creating a building. And this country, particularly, it's very famous for its red bricks,
Yeah.
which are very, very carbon intensive because they require a lot of energy to manufacture. Things like cement, things like steel bars that go into buildings, all of these different materials have a significant environmental impact, both from the element of extraction all the way through to the manufacturing. And so all of this contributes to that rather large number of contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. And then I haven't even touched on the actual construction process of all of that digging and bringing materials and all of that cost that ultimately translates into greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's a massive supply chain system. People may or may not know as scope 3, all of those materials that come into it.
Yeah.
And the supply chains for just a simple house must be enormous. How do you even start looking at sustainability when the supply chains are so long and so vast?
There are certain elements that ultimately come to the choice of the developer, to the choice of the architect, the engineer, really thinking about certain materials ultimately have a higher consumption of energy and a higher carbon impact than others. So I talk about red brick and I talk about cement as the typical troublemakers, if you will, in the supply chain. And there's efforts to decarbonize, but they're really hard industries to change. And there's a lot of innovation happening. But even just changing the materials that are being chosen at point of constructing a house, considering different options and just changing a lot of what we expect. Part of it is also social norms, and I think that's one of the most interesting things when we're talking about the construction industry. I have the privilege of working internationally, and one of the most surprising things to me is that you can walk in a central business district anywhere in the world and it looks exactly the same.
Yes.
no matter the climate. So you see the great big glass office towers because that is what we perceive as high-end office buildings. But put them in 50-degree weather with raging sunshine, it's a giant greenhouse. And it doesn't make any sense. And, their utility bills are super high. But because it's a social norm, people continue to choose that. And the same is true of our homes. People want to follow what is typically accepted. People want to be part of that group think. And when group think is typically and historically higher in environmental impact, then it just perpetuates the problem.
So how do we change that?
Better choices, better training, and scalability. So, I mean, one of the biggest barriers to getting this done is perceived cost. Nobody wants to spend more, even if they know that it's the better thing to do. And if we take the typical example of a homeowner, no homeowner is going to turn around to you and say, "No, I don't want a sustainable building, or I don't want in a building that's more efficient," because of course there's benefits. But the question that always follows is, but how much more is it going to cost me, and can I afford this? Same is true in the corporate sector. As soon as you start talking about sustainability, it always shifts into cost. Now, I do use the word perceived cost quite intentionally because I think there's quite a lot of things that can be done and are low hanging fruit that people typically just don't get into because of this initial barrier. So things, if we think about again earlier that difference between operational and embodied, when we're talking about the operational energy, designing and making sure that your building is as efficient as possible creates clear monetary returns because you're using less resources. If you can put things in your building that make it more energy efficient, if you can make sure your insulation is protecting the temperature, the core temperature inside, so you don't need heating and cooling, you're going to be spending less on your utility bills. Same is true for water. Water currently is not being costed at its actual value. But if we start to see the changing climate in the UK, but around the world as well, and water scarcity increasing and the cost of water goes up, then all of a sudden making sure that you've got a water efficient building is going to be super important and will translate into monetary costs. Now, when we move into areas such as materials, then the one-to-one example is a little bit more difficult because you're not saying, okay, I chose this sustainable material and therefore my utility bill is less, but it all contributes because if you can find, again, materials that are lower carbon impact, but ultimately can still work towards that thermal comfort, work towards having that good insulation, that ultimately will benefit you. There's so many practitioners out there that do calculations, there's calculators, there's a plethora of information and lots of options. But part of the challenge is also simplifying it and making it accessible to people because in sustainability we also have a death by information and too many complex decisions to be made and caveats, and if you do this then this, but there's all these considerations to make. So simplification of information is equally as important as the decision making and bringing it to people.
So cost isn't as easy as it sounds. Everybody thinks that cost is a problem, but actually they need to look at it a little bit more deeply. And that comes up as a barrier. What are the motivators to making your new building, let's go there first, more sustainable?
Motivators come in typically 2 to 3 forms, depending if you're talking about residential or commercial. Generally, because there's a push from government, there's a push to make greener buildings and to decarbonize. There's changing regulation. There's sometimes government incentives for people that are able to be sustainable. And that ultimately has translated to pressure from the investment community. So financial institutions, banks are looking to make sure that they are decarbonizing, and their equivalent scope 3 is all of their lending. So they're looking for green investments. And so oftentimes at this stage, there's also financial incentives to be able to make a building sustainable. So it might be a reduction of basis points and interest rates. It could be some kind of additional technical support. Different banks offering different packages, but there are actual benefits right now to building sustainably. And then the third is there's still a marketing advantage because even though there are plenty of people that are building green, it's still not the norm. And so companies in particular are able to get branding and able to sell sometimes at a higher price for themselves, or able to market themselves as leaders by doing that. Typically on the homeowner side, so on the residential side, the benefit and the driver is either a green mortgage, which might have a reduced interest rate, and then also the savings that come from having a more efficient home. I mean, we talk about EPCs in the UK and
Yep.
massive asterisk on the accuracy of what does it all mean, but ultimately what you're looking for is, can you find a home that is going to be using less energy, less electricity, because that comes at a benefit to you.
And one of the tools that is presented as a proof point for certainly in data to adhere to the regulations and to be able to use in marketing without greenwashing are certifications. For our listeners that might not be familiar, what is green building certification and why is it an important tool?
Mm-hmm. So I'll probably start with the why and then I'll come into the what. But when we're talking about sustainability, it's such a vast term and can mean so many different things. And you can have, let's call it 10 real estate agents telling you about this green building or this green home, and they could all be talking about different things. And it's really hard to tell and what it is to compare them against one another. And that's really part of the purpose of a green building certification, is to be able to specify the scope. So to say, this is what green means in this case, and to create a standard way of checking those credentials so that you don't only have a comparable way of looking at the different sustainability credentials, but also some kind of validation or assurance that, you know, I didn't come up with this today and said grey is green and now you have to believe me, but there's some kind of system underneath that that's checking and providing that credibility so that there's no greenwashing happening. So really the purpose of green building certifications is to standardize what is being defined and to create comparable metrics, and also to add a little bit of governance behind sustainability to make sure that, you know, there's no playing around with data, or there's no let me show you this one shiny thing that I've done here and ignore the 10 terrible things that I've done
Yeah.
over there.
So what are, and the reason we're sat here today is to talk about certifications and how Centrali fits into that. What are the current available certifications?
There are so many. Last time I counted, there's over 85 around the world. So I won't go into each of those. But fundamentally, there's some big international ones that have been applied across the world. And then there's also a wide variety of local certifications that typically develop based on a specific country and its needs. So the UK was actually a pioneer in green building certification. So the first green building certification was BREEAM, which is UK founded, created by BRE back in the 90s. And that sort of set off the trend of various different certification schemes around the world. Some of the other really familiar names are LEED, which is US based. Another one very famous in Australia, but also the UK, Neighbours, which is more about performance. There's a health and well-being standard called WELL. We're working on an international one called EDGE, which is newer. So that was only founded in 2015. And then there's loads of regional ones. So Green Mark, Green Star, all kinds of different certifications. And what's interesting about them is that while there's overlap between all of them, none of them are identical. So they're all thinking about sustainability in the built environment in a slightly different way. They might be measuring and scoring things in a different way. They might have different focuses, different baselines, different expectations, different processes. So everything is very nuanced and it's considered an alphabet soup of certification schemes.
Yeah, certainly from what I've seen, it doesn't seem like any of them are fit for purpose. And actually, what you touched on is actually it probably needs to be a more local focused approach rather than a one size fits all, which happens a lot in sustainability. I think the question that comes up quite a lot is, do you think certifications are just a tick box for when the building is built, or are there better certifications that are looking at continuous improvement, which would be more important to me personally?
So I get that question a lot. And I think it's quite an important debate to have. So um, I'll touch on the tick box exercise first, because I think there's a a double-edged sword when it comes to certification. So some of the barriers that we talked about earlier was the complexity and the level of nuance when it comes to sustainability in general, regardless of which sector you're looking at. Unless you're in the field and have spent years and years and years trying to untangle what's going on from the outside, it's very, very difficult to understand and to make good decisions. What certification does, whether in buildings or not, is try to simplify that and try to bring out what best practice is and create the checklist so that someone doesn't go off and recreate the wheel. So, is it a tick box exercise? Yes. But is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. What a certification is trying to do is to say, this is what good looks like. These are the things you should be thinking about. This is how you should go about it. And then allow for the level of bringing things together, selecting what makes sense based on the site, that localization component. But it is trying to simplify the complex, which I think is actually a good thing. And when we're talking about scale and when we're talking about how do you bring up that baseline of a typical building, it's the only way that's going to happen, because currently what's happening in the industry is that you've got maybe 10, 20% of the industry that's doing great, and then everyone else is not doing anything. And the only way to bridge that gap is to take those people on the journey and to make sure they're really taking those steps. And part of that is the accessibility of information. Now, there's definitely gamification, and this is, I wish that human beings could gamify for good and not just for bad. But there is definitely gamification, and there's absolutely people that just do the bare minimum and use it as a bare minimum element. But I don't think the concept is broken. And the ideal is that the checklist, the tick mark exercise, is there at the design stage to help you make those considerations up front, to change the way that you're thinking about it, maybe for the end goal of checking those things off a list. But if you've changed your decision making process, then you've achieved the element that you want to. But of course, to your second question, that doesn't necessarily take away the difference between I've designed a building well and it's actually doing what I thought it was going to do over time. And this is in the industry known as the performance gap, where on the one hand, an architect can sit in their office, design a perfect building that's got everything you would think it to be efficient, and then you put human beings in, and they're unpredictable and irrational, and they don't operate the building as you thought they would, or something breaks, or somebody installed a system that you didn't anticipate or isn't installed properly, and then all of a sudden the building is super inefficient, even though it's got the certification that says it should be a top grade building. And that's really that importance of how do you make sure over the lifetime of a building, which is decades, how do you maintain that and how do you monitor that and make those decisions? Now, there's a lot in the industry in terms of sensor data and building management systems, and we're going to automate this and do this and do all of that. But even though it's been discussed for years and years and years, it's still an issue in terms of that long-term management. And how do you feed that data back into the decision makers and also back into the certifications? So we'll talk about certifications in a moment, because that's really an outcome. It's not the intention. A certification is something that you should be doing to validate what it is that you're doing, but it shouldn't be the be all end all. But in terms of data, going back to decision makers, facilities managers tend to access that kind of data. It is being used to monitor. It's usually used for monetary purposes in terms of, hey, my bills are super high. But it's missing a holistic approach, and it's missing that more integrated question of, is it fit for purpose? I think you've said that a couple of times, and that's super important to keep top of mind. And is it fit for that particular building and not just an industry standard? Because every group of tenants, every homeowner, everybody will be a little bit different. And the certifications world hasn't really caught up to that either. There's Neighbours, which looks at energy performance data. BREEAM and LEED and EDGE have an in-operation certification, but it's not to the depth that design level and kind of the as built, if you will, certifications have. So ongoing conversation, still not really resolved. And it doesn't feel like this time next year, I'd be able to turn around and say, yeah, this has all been happening in the background, and actually it's fixed today. It feels like quite a slow burn in terms of the industry.
And how does Centauri and Edge fit into this?
So Edge was designed by the World Bank to think about that accessibility question and to think about how do we get all of the buildings around the world to meet these kinds of sustainability credentials. It was designed particularly with emerging economies in mind, thinking about the fact that most of the new buildings are going to be built in Africa, in South America, across Asia. And those were countries where the building codes weren't super stringent, and there was a lot of potential to do things better and to leapfrog across the bad building practices that we've seen that do happen around the world. So they designed a system with a software tool thinking about really that accessibility and to think about it as a design tool. It was really successful, and since then it's scaled around the world. It primarily focuses on that design and construction stage, as similar to the other certification schemes, and is currently in the development of an operational standard. There is one for zero carbon, but it's for the companies and developers that are really going for that zero carbon certification, but there's a gap in between which says you're not going to go from I've just built a building to okay, and tomorrow it's going to be zero carbon. There's quite a long journey in there, and a lot of that is around that data management and operational management of a building. So that's in the works right now. But Edge was actually really successful as a scalable tool, so it's now available around the world and has been implemented in the UK as well, largely because it's trying to think about how do we take those lessons learned and bring the options to the built environment as upfront as possible, show the costs, because of course the case for building green is always the number one question any management's going to ask, and give people the tools to then localize what the options are. So it's got a local baseline for every country around the world. It's got climatic data. So if you're based in Aberdeen versus London, how you can make your building more efficient will look differently because you'll have different requirements, different heating, for example, requirements, climatic conditions, etc. So Edge was trying to meet that gap in the market, whereas other certification schemes historically had started more as the very holistic, quite high-end type of certifications for developments.
And does it work for old buildings? So looking at retrofitting as well?
It does. It wasn't designed for retrofit, but has been applied for retrofit and is actually being used quite a lot, particularly across Europe. Of course, in Europe, 80% of the building stock will exist in 2050. So when we're talking about Europe, the biggest challenge we have is thinking about all of those old buildings that are really leaky and cold, and potentially when we're talking about the UK and conservation zones where you can't even touch them or you can't do a variety of different things. So the retrofit conversation is super, super important in the UK, and it can be applied. The only difference is that you've got fewer options. But I mean, I think for me, this is one of the biggest takeaways when we're talking about the built environment. Everything is defined. We don't have that many unknowns because we are limited by physics and engineering and construction. So there's only so much you can do to a building to make it more efficient, to reduce its impact. And the difference between a new build and an existing building is that in a new build, you've got a blank piece of paper, so you can do some design decisions. For example, which way is the building facing? Is it south facing or north facing? And to think about certain things. But when we're talking about retrofit, you're simply removing some of the elements and saying, okay, where I had 50 options, now I have 10. And where I had 50 options where maybe the 10 were very low cost because actually it was just a design decision, now the cost of retrofit is a bit higher than if it's a new building, but I still know what I can do. And there is a limited number of options. So it's not that we don't know what to do. We just don't have, in my opinion, the political will and the desire to just get it done.
I guess you've spoke about cost quite a lot. Certifications in themselves will cost. So the will is obviously going to be held back by that, as well as not having enough regulations in place. How do you challenge that?
I don't think every single building needs to be certified. In an ideal world, you end up in a place where that information and that sustainability impact data can be monitored and verified without having to go through an independent certification scheme. So we've talked about EPCs. In an ideal world where an equivalent EPC mechanism worked, you could have that information and have that verification and that trust, because ultimately what is certification doing? It's bringing some level of standardization and it's bringing some level of trust that we're all talking about apples, we're comparing apples to apples, and I trust that your apple is indeed an apple of the type that you said it is. So it doesn't, we don't have to end up in a world where every single building is certified, but we do need to end up in a world where every building has some level of environmental credentials, that it's less polluting than it is right now, and that we've improved that basis, that status quo. So some certifications are a lot more cost effective than others. I mean, you're talking about a range from a certification scheme could be about, say, £10,000, and a certification scheme could be £100,000 for the same building, but using a different rating scheme. So there are options in terms of how cost effective it can be. But this is also where the drivers are super important. So if you're getting a preferential interest rate and you're reducing it by, 10, 100 basis points, then all of a sudden that cost is pretty much absorbed by the preferential interest rate that you got. The flip side of this as well is that at some point, we're going to move from incentives to penalties. So right now, we're still at the early part of adoption. So banks, governments, even the market is trying to encourage the creation of these types of buildings. And so there's a lot of positive reinforcement. At some point, it's going to flip and say, well, this is your regulatory minimum. And therefore, if you don't do this, your interest rates will be higher, or you will not be able to get your planning permission, or the costs will be different. So right now there's enough in there in the market to kind of incentivize and drive growth that absorbs the cost of certification.
It's amazing. So you're saying not everybody needs a certification. That's great for smaller projects, but how do they get the information they need to retrofit their building or to build their building in a more
Absolutely.
sustainable way?
Yeah. So this is where tools and frameworks are super valuable. There's a lot of research and a lot of tools out there in the industry that allow people to understand how to make better decisions. They can educate themselves. They can make those choices. Part of the benefit, and I think for small businesses and for smaller projects, is to find professionals that can help them, that again don't cost an arm and a leg. So really thinking about who are the sustainable architects that are out there. Are there engineers that have some sustainability credentials that can help give that guidance, that can help maybe even take the concepts behind the certifications and say, you don't need to go for the certification at the end, but hey, if you look at this checklist, this tick mark exercise, these are the things that you should be thinking about. What can we implement in your project? So in a way, it's almost looking at certifications as your guidance, whether you go for certification or not, because that's ultimately what they've done. They've aggregated years of research and said, based on looking through the data, these are the things that make a difference. These are the areas that will actually contribute to a more sustainable building. And then you just need someone to be able to interpret that. And the biggest challenge, of course, with smaller businesses is they don't have the people, they don't
Yeah.
have the time. It's one of those, yeah, I'd love to do it, but which is completely understandable. As a small business owner, I understand. But that's kind of where that community of professionals, where you can bring that advice in, as well as access to tools and courses. So one of the things that I love about Edge is that they've made the software free. You don't need
Wonderful.
to pay for the certification. You don't need to go for certification. You can go in, you can figure it out. You can click on the buttons and see what is a greener building, and that's it. And that was very intentional, because that is the accessibility element. That's the first barrier. And if you can get everybody thinking about it and everybody implementing it, then you've actually seen that impact that you want to have.
Amazing. So you've spoken about financial institutions investing because of government incentives to do so, marketing playing a big role in it, and certifications as well. Is there a role for communities who don't own buildings they live and work in, or tenants, to drive demand for better, greener building practices?
Absolutely. I mean, this is my biggest frustration, is when developers come and go, well, I want to do sustainability, but people just don't want it. People just don't want green homes. So, the demand's not there, so I'm not going to do it. And it's so frustrating because yet again, the onus falls on communities to be the driving force when there's so many other players that can play into it. But I'm a big believer that community and people as individuals ultimately are what drive change. There's a variety of different things that communities can do. And also when we think about the built environment. So I've talked a lot of today about decarbonization, but of course, sustainable buildings go far beyond just the building. It's also the green infrastructure around it. It's the spaces. It's the ability to protect biodiversity. It's the accessibility to nature. It's the well-being inside the building. There's so many different elements of a sustainable building that ultimately impact the communities and impact their day-to-day lives. So, whether it's talking to their landlords, asking questions, sometimes all it takes is asking, what kind of heating do we have in the building? And is the building doing anything around, green infrastructure, or asking or saying, hey, we've got like a little green space outside. Is it possible to look at that as a community garden, or can we think about rewilding and bringing biodiversity? Asking questions of the people that are looking after the building starts to plant the seed in the landlords that, oh, hey, someone actually is thinking about this and someone's caring about it. And could this make a difference? For those that are in a position of seeking to purchase, seeking to rent, asking again about those credentials, asking the agents, asking the landlords, having those conversations is ultimately what's going to show that there is the beginnings of demand happening. And then for anybody that is part of a housing association or any kind of community group, there are actions that you can take to make a building more sustainable, whether it's thinking about, again, those gardens, those spaces, those communal spaces, and how those could be transformed. So there is quite a lot of top down when it comes to buildings, but also there can be bottom up. And I think the first and foremost thing to do is just to start having conversations about it and to start asking questions, because that can spark bigger impact than you would ever think.
I'd never even considered asking as a tenant the landlord about what we can do about biodiversity. But then I've just remembered I did ask about planting vegetables and growing produce in the garden, and the last one did say yes. But I hadn't thought about going even further and saying, oh, what about other impacts that we can have for the local
Yeah.
area?
And I think, the word biodiversity can be quite, feel quite distant from our day to day of thinking like, okay, well, what can we do? And biodiversity is this very, very large concept. But ultimately, it's just how can you help bring nature back to the developments, and how can you make sure that there's animals can cross and the insects, and you're providing a space where nature can thrive. Development has historically pretty much gotten rid of nature, and there are absolutely developers that are doing wonderful things, and there's really beautiful places, but there's also so many developments that are concrete and a couple of trees and maybe a shrub and that's it. We've really disconnected nature from places, from our cities, from our towns, from our communities, and there's a really natural intersection of the two that also brings benefits to the people living there, because who doesn't want to go outside of their home, outside of their office, and see a little bit of greenery and be able to sit outside, especially on sunny days. I know they feel far away right now, but there's so many opportunities, and I think sometimes changing the language as well, and just thinking about what is it that we can do when it comes to nature, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to finding harmony between the outdoor and the indoor world. I think sometimes just changing that narrative can help people realize that they can make a difference.
I think we've entirely forgotten that even though we've built ourselves into these concrete boxes, that all of these materials surrounding us came from nature ultimately. So it's within what we've created, but we've forgotten where it's come from and how to look after that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, I think the moment that you start observing and understanding that the impact that the built environment has on your life. COVID did that a little bit when all of a sudden we went, oh no, we're stuck inside, we're stuck in this box, and what is it? And then you started to say, oh well, do I have access to nature, and do I have access to natural spaces, and the well-being component came top of mind. And then time passes and people forget. It's a very human element, but it's it's amazing what we have created, and how much we've separated ourselves from the world. But the opportunities are there, and if we come back to the biggest challenge here being retrofit, it's built, but there are still improvements to be made that can be made. And I think retrofit is more expensive than building from scratch because you are more limited. But one of the greatest and most exciting things around retrofit is community level. So, how can you think about it at a neighborhood level? How can you think about it as beyond an individual building, but as a block of buildings where you can find those co benefits? And then that cost becomes much more manageable because you find efficiencies of scale. And so then you've got a nice interlink which says you're also building community by having those conversations at a community level, because the other element of all of this is we talk about community, but we've also become increasingly separated as people, again, through the way that we've done our built environment. So you're creating community and you're finding solutions that make sense for the community, that make more financial sense and can help some of these more challenging retrofit conversations.
So looking to the future, and it's a really big question and quite broad, but what does a truly sustainable built environment look like in 20 years and how do we get there?
I think a truly sustainable built environment looks very different depending on where you are. I'm based in London, so as I think about London in 20 years, it's going to be very, very different conversation than more rural England versus somewhere in South Africa versus China. So, and I always say that because we work internationally, I get to see the pace of development across different places. But I think I really stand by this concept of local community and really thinking about how do you localize and bring things closer together and create the better places for people that ultimately have more benefits for the planet. So it's not just about buildings. A truly sustainable environment to me, a built environment to me would be, first of all, trying to get buildings and blocks of buildings to be self-reliant. So how can they be generating energy? How can they be using as few resources as possible? How can they be harvesting rainwater? Things that, again, have existed for a long time, but actually implemented at scale and working at that community level, because again, some of these solutions just aren't applicable or won't be able to be implemented on an individual house. We haven't even touched on ownership of buildings and mixed ownership and lots of different tenants and how do you navigate those human elements of buildings. But looking at it in a local sort of site specific, smaller communities, finding those solutions that make sense for a larger group of buildings, and then bringing nature back into our communities and finding better harmony with the natural environment. I really hope that, in a very short time frame, we can start to say that any new building that is being built is sustainable, is net zero. I mean, the fact that we're still building today buildings that are not net zero, but we know that we need to be net zero by 2050 is mind-boggling. We're building things that are going to be retrofit. So that feels like that should be a short-term goal, but it still feels a bit far away. But I hope and I maintain that there's a lot of goodwill around. There's people that are trying really hard to make things happen, and we just need everyone to understand that this is a collective problem. This is something that affects each and every one of us, but also brings so much benefit to each of us if we're able to achieve this. It's here, we know the solutions, we know what needs to be done, and it's just a matter of coming together and working on the execution. We're not waiting for a crazy innovation for buildings. We just need to work on execution.
And what's one key takeaway you would like our audience to leave with today?
You can make a difference when it comes to buildings. Start having conversations, whether it's with your landlord, whether it's with your community, whether it's with your friends, your colleagues. Start asking questions about, what is my building like? Is it sustainable? Is it resource efficient? Is there nature around? And is there anything we could do to make it better, even if it's really small? And I guarantee you will find at least one thing that you could do to improve your building, and it will make a difference.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Eleni. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining me here today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the GreenTruth podcast. We hope you found our discussion enlightening and inspiring. Remember, it's through understanding truth in action that we can pave the way for a sustainable future. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking conversations, and don't forget to leave us a review. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the truth.